Okay. Is this on my nose or somewhere? So the center for the explanation of consciousness, when we have money, isn't too tacky. But right now we don't have any money, so it's just Paul Skakowski and I, and Dekron. The proper name is the Intergalactic Center for the Study of Consciousness. We do have a speaker coming up.
Yeah.
Who? You don't know.
Craig Callender.
Oh.
UCSD.
Oh, okay. So if you're not on our mailing list, send email to paulsco@gmail, I guess, or something. Paulsco at Stanford. Yeah, okay.
It's going to be Monday, May 6th, probably around 6 o'clock, 5:30.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about self-knowledge. Going to cover a lot of ground, all the way from worms to Descartes and Wittgenstein. None of it with any plausibility or depth. But I'm going to start with a physicist, Ernst Mach. Ernst Mach got on a bus or a tram or something in Vienna one day. He's kind of tired, going home from work, I guess. He got on the back like you can do in Europe. And he looked towards the front of the relatively crowded tram, and he saw a shabby pedagogue. And he thought to himself, that man is a shabby pedagogue. And in fact, he was looking at himself in the big mirror that the conductor had at the front of the bus so he could keep track about what was happening at the back of the bus. But he didn't realize that for a while. Then when he did realize it, he said, I am that man. And then he said, I am a shabby pedagogue. Any questions so far? Okay. So that gives us 2/3 of my talk, because I'm going to discuss 3 kinds of self-knowledge, and this has 2 kinds. The first kind is knowledge of the person one happens to be, and that's what he had when he got on the bus and saw himself in the mirror, but didn't realize it was himself, but learned about the person he was seeing, that he needed to comb his hair and straighten his tie and brush the lint off his vest and so forth and so on. Is that self-knowledge? Well, it was knowledge of a person by the same person. So it's self-knowledge, but it's not the normal kind of self-knowledge. So I call it knowledge of the person one happens to be. And it happens all the time, you know, but I won't tell any political jokes, so I can't mention most of them. Then, just to remind you, once he got to step 2, he had what we would call ordinary self-knowledge, which is usually expressed in English with the word I. When he got to step 3. So we got ordinary self-knowledge, and we got knowledge of the person one happens to be. But I think to understand the relations between those 2 and to understand ordinary self-knowledge, we need to understand a 3rd kind of self-knowledge, which I call primitive self-knowledge. Dale's interest perks up like ants and bees have, and worms, undergraduates, you know, things like that. What do I mean by primitive self-knowledge? Well, two introductory concepts before we get to that. Am I boring you, Jenny? Normally self-informative ways of knowing. There are ways of knowing about people that normally are ways about knowing about the same person as the knower, to put it inelegantly, right? Like proprioception. That's how you know if your legs are crossed. Now, it's very hard to know if someone else's legs are crossed using proprioception, or is it anyway, whatever it is. Try as hard as I can. I can look at David and see that his legs aren't crossed. But I couldn't tell it in the same way that I can tell that my legs aren't crossed. And then there is interoception, which has various subcategories that I can neither spell nor pronounce. But that's how you know if you're hungry or if your bladder is full and stuff like that. And then there's introspection, which is how you know what's going on in your mind. And those are all methods for finding out what somebody's thinking, whether somebody's bladder is full, whether they're hungry, whether their legs are crossed, that basically only work to find out about one person, yourself. So those are what I call normally self-informative ways of knowing. And the 5 ordinary senses are also normally self-informative. You have to be a little more careful. I mean, but they tell you about objects in front of you, vision that is. So the self still comes in. I can't find out what Trump is seeing by seeing or whatever. I can't tell what object in front of Trump right now. Well, actually, a TV and a hamburger, I suppose. But I don't do that. Never mind. You get the idea. Okay. Now, I call these normally self-informative because imaginative philosophers can think of weird cases. And someday, mad but no doubt well-funded scientists may actually produce some cases. So my fantasy is you have this gifted neurosurgeon and practical joker. And she goes to movie theaters with people in front of her, takes out her kit, and because she's extremely skilled, without them noticing at all, wires them up so that this person is getting signals from this person's stomach and bladder, and vice versa. And she finds that very amusing. This person eats more and more popcorn and drinks more and more Coke and just doesn't seem to be able to quench their thirst. And this person, not eating anything or drinking anything, gets more and more antsy and nervous and finally darts for the restroom. Time to laugh, right? I don't know who would fund it, but maybe Templeton, I don't know. So they're normally self-informative, but pretty broad range of normally. It would really be weird if you were able to find out if someone else was hungry in the same way you find out if you're hungry, and so forth and so on. How about introspection? Can we even imagine how that would work with introspection? Well, I can't, but that's not a very good test for whether somebody could. Now, there's also what I call normally self-affecting movements. That is, there's ways of moving your limbs and your fingers that are designed to produce certain effects on you. I don't know if they're designed, but are ways of producing effects on the person doing the moving. They would have to move in quite a different way to have the same effect on another person. So I can scratch my head by doing this, but I can't scratch David's head by doing that. I can comb my hair by doing this, but it's hopeless in David's. I guess I'd have to do this. So, and that's, again, it's not a necessary truth, right? If we find somewhere a group of people that have necks that go like this, right, then this will be a way of scratching the head of the person to your left. But normally, with a broad range of, human experience, it's pretty much always been a way of scratching your own head or scratching your own back. So these things often go together. There's a way of knowing that your back needs scratching, namely feeling an itch, and there's a way of scratching. Normally effective movements, clearing one's own throat, eating by putting things in one's mouth, scratching an itch, or in the case of Mach, brushing the lint from one's tie, like this. If you try to brush the lint from somebody else's tie, these days, wouldn't be a good idea. Now, primitive self-knowledge involves normally self-informative knowing, motivating normally self-affecting action. And we find that very deep in nature. So my favorite example is a chicken. So I spent some of my life with chickens. I think I know them fairly well, not on a scientific basis, but they're pretty dumb. But chickens are very good at eating. And, from my observations, a typical chicken looks around the barnyard. If they see a kernel of corn in front of them, they will walk to the kernel of corn and peck. And notice that their visual system gave them information about what was in front of them, the very same chicken who was doing the seeing. I mean, a lot of what philosophers say sound really ridiculously oversimple, unless you're a really famous philosopher like Heidegger, in which case it makes no sense at all. So I'll try to get both sides covered in today's talk. So the way a chicken works, basically, 90% of the time when it's light out, and they're not worried about eggs and stuff, they look around the barnyard, they see a kernel of corn, they walk to the kernel of corn, they peck. Normally self-informative, normally self-affecting action, because that gets the kernel in their mouth where they swallow it, and it eventually nourishes them. And Mother Nature says, wow, evolution at its best. Should have stopped there. Even worms. I raise worms, so I know a little bit about worms too. And, they're not as stupid as they look. They crawl around. They have a way of getting information about what they're rubbing against, which can either be another worm, in which case interesting things happen, or it can be something really good for them, like dog excrement, or it can be a stone. And what they do will depend on that information about what their nose is in touch with, and it works in a way that works to their benefit. Now, when we look at animals and try to see how smart they are, one thing that animal psychologists have come up with, starting with George Gallup, is the mirror test. And the mirror test is very controversial. What does it show? What doesn't it show? Who can really pass it? Who can't pass it? I won't go into any of those complications. I'll just accept it for what Gallup said it was. So what Gallup did is he put, as probably all of you know, he put some stuff on the head of a chimpanzee without the chimpanzee knowing it, but stuff the chimpanzee wouldn't want there, and let the chimpanzee look in a mirror, and lo and behold, eventually the chimpanzee brushes it off. He passes the mirror test. What does that mean? He got information about himself or herself in a not normally self-informative way, but used it to motivate a normally self-affecting action. That's what you have to do to pass the mirror test. And some animals pass it, and some animals don't pass it. Elephants pass it. For a long time, it was thought that dogs don't pass it. But recent research back at NYU shows they do pass it. Except you can't just use a mirror, because dogs are not very visual animals. But if you take a cup of their own urine and put it behind the mirror, they do fine. So try that with your dog at home. Chickens don't. Some birds do, some birds don't, chickens don't. Humans do after about 2 years of age. So the mirror test kind of tests for what I think of as the integration of primitive self-knowledge and knowledge about members of the same species gathered in non-self-informative ways. So why don't chickens, well, let's see, okay. Don't like to read, but then if I don't read, I get lost. So what Mach had to do, or what I think, what primitive self-knowledge doesn't do, so you can have primitive self-knowledge. Let me go back to chicken. Chickens do have conceptions of other chickens. Chicken will treat other chickens different depending on whether they're big or small. And particularly roosters will treat differently depending on whether they're big or small. It will treat the farmer different than the farmer's daughter who likes to come out and throw fake kernels of corn around to see what happens. So they've got the ability to have, you know, with quotation marks, italics, whatever we need to not take it too seriously, ideas, perturbations in their little brain that somehow stand for, keep track of, allow accumulation of memory about individual chickens. But, and they have the ability a chicken can see that another chicken has a kernel of corn in front of it. And if it's a little chicken, it'll go over and scare it away. If it's a big chicken, it won't. So if we think of it in terms of language, and just for illustration, I don't think chickens have studied Chomsky, so they don't have a language of thought. But if they did have a language of thought, the chicken's language of thought would be divided into two parts. It would have a part in which the verb has a kernel of corn in front of it. That's not really a verb, is it? Sees a kernel of corn, has a subject, X sees a kernel of corn. And then it would have another part where it just has a sentence, kernel, or low kernel, K-E-R-N-E-L. Right. And the second language they use for themselves. When they see a kernel of corn, the chickens, my chickens don't say, oh, the chicken who is doing this perceiving has a kernel of corn in front of it. Or if they're named Gertrude, they don't say, Gertrude has a kernel of corn in front of her. And they don't have a first person, so they don't say, I have a kernel of corn in front of me. They don't need to. They don't need to keep track of who they're learning about in this special way, because the only one they ever learn about is them. They don't even need to have a way of thinking about it that makes it a special case of the other part of their language, where they say, oh, my friend Matilda has a kernel of corn in front of her. I think I'll frighten her away. Oh, they don't say, my friend Matilda has a kernel. No, they can't say that either. Matilda has a kernel of corn in front of her. Scare away, eat. That's how they would think of that. But at some point, and this is kind of what the mirror tests for, animals and children develop the ability to integrate primitive self-knowledge and knowledge gained in non-normally self-informative ways that happens to be about themselves, right? Knowledge about the chicken they happen to be, except chickens can't do it. But knowledge about the chimpanzee they happen to be seeing in a mirror, they can do it. Okay. So that's what my picture of normal self-knowledge is in the human case. We have lots of primitive self-knowledge. You never outgrow your need for self-knowledge. My favorite example of that is George Bush. We all remember the time when an Iraqi journalist threw his shoe at George Bush, right? Well, what did Bush do? He moved. Now, we might say that's just stimulus response, but it's rational. It was the rational thing to do. He executed a movement that in the situation kept him from getting hit by a shoe, which I'm pretty sure he didn't want to do. But I'm pretty sure he didn't think, oh, there is a shoe coming at George Bush. I am George Bush. I'd better move. Whap! Would have taken too long. Right? Most of our lives, we just rely on primitive self-knowledge, at least till the second cup of coffee. You want to eat something? No, okay. Okay, so ordinary self-knowledge. So ordinary self-knowledge integrates primitive self-knowledge and knowledge gained in non-normally self-informative ways. That's my key theory. Now the point is, to integrate it, you got to have something like an idea of yourself. The worm doesn't need to have an idea of itself. The chicken doesn't need to have an idea of itself. It doesn't need to keep track of who the kernel of corn is in front of. It doesn't have to check that the person who sees the kernel of, that the chicken who sees the kernel of corn and the chicken who pecks the kernel of corn is the same one who digests the kernel of corn. It's only when you start combining primitive self-knowledge with knowledge that doesn't come prepackaged as being about you that you need what I call a self-notion. And that raises the problem, what makes a self-notion? The idea of a person that we would express with the word I, what makes it about us? And my answer is because it is where the primitive self-knowledge goes, right? Nothing more. No special egocentric name, nothing like that. It's the most natural thing in the world for an organism to have primitive self-knowledge. And when you get sophisticated, like chimpanzees and us and 2-year-olds, and you start to integrate knowledge about yourself gained in other informative ways, you throw it into that same file, and that's what makes it about you. That's my theory of the self. Now, this is what Mach was missing when he only knew that the person he saw, say, had lint on his vest. So he sees himself, but he doesn't know it's himself. He says, that shabby pedagogue has lint all over his vest. But he doesn't do this. Why? Because he hasn't integrated that fact about himself with the things he knows about himself via primitive self-knowledge, and therefore it doesn't trigger normally self-affecting action. Where am I? Okay. So self-notions are ideas that incorporate knowledge about oneself gained in both self-informative and other informative ways. Now, should we say that the chicken has knowledge about itself? No. It's misleading. Well, what should we say? We've got to say something. Here I think it's important to keep the theorist and the thing theorized about separate, distinct. Well, you have to keep them separate, but so here I am, a graduate student at Stanford, 5th year, writing a dissertation on bees or ants, and I'm theorizing about them. I'm thinking about how they pick up information and how it affects them, and how this somehow is a result of evolution, So it somehow affects them in some way that, at least in the large population, is going to have value. So I'm thinking about the chicken. I'm a chicken theorist. Because once you've thrown kernels of corn out, you don't have a lot to do for the rest of the afternoon. Now, I need to describe that chicken's visual perception in terms of its veridicality conditions. Because that perception can be true or false. Because some of our friends down the street will take that chicken into a AI lab or a chicken eye lab or something, and they'll give this chicken perceptions that aren't true. And it'll go around pecking on the floor of some concrete lab and eventually die. Or the farmer's daughter comes out and throws her little BBs covered with gum to make them look like corn kernels. And it will have a non-veridical perception. So I need to say that perception is true under these conditions. Why is that important? Because to explain the whole transaction, I have to say that perception, because of the architecture of the chicken, leads it to perform an action that will be successful given the needs of that very same chicken if the perception is veridical. That is, if the perception is veridical and it is corn, the pecking will result in nourishment. The chicken doesn't have to figure that out. The chicken doesn't need to keep track of the identity of, here we get into the problem of pecker, of the seer, the pecker, the digester, and the getting nutrition-der. But I, as a theorist, do. So in those cases, I want to say that the chicken has a perception concerning her. It's not about her in the sense that she has an idea of herself that's somehow wrapped up in the perception or strongly associated with perception. But I, as a theorist, say it's information about her. And I have to keep track of that. So I use the word concerning for that. Did David and I, did we invent the word, I mean, I don't think we invented the word concerning, but maybe we came up with it for this purpose. So now this is a phenomenon that doesn't just have to do with chickens. Suppose you've got a 5-year-old with a watch, and it's back in a more civilized time when 5-year-olds weren't on the net all day. So you tell your 5-year-old, come back at noon for lunch. And she goes down to the beach, and you know she's going to look at her watch, and she's going to see it's 12, and she's going to come back in time for lunch. What did she know? She knew it was 12 o'clock. But wait a minute, there's no such thing as being 12 o'clock. That's a property of locations. It's 12 o'clock in Palo Alto when it's, I don't know, God knows what time, when it's 3 o'clock in Denver, and whatever, 4 o'clock in New York, or something like that. 3 in New York. 3, yeah, well, see, I don't travel much, so I don't know. What time is it when it's 5 o'clock here, Jenny. What time is it in Hong Kong? 9 a.m. See, I mean, actually, you can't quite tell the truth about this without appearing chauvinistic. Of course, Pacific Coast time is real time. And the others are just mistakes to make it easier to keep track of when lunch. I'm kidding. Okay.
I think that's in one of Einstein's papers.
Yeah. Greenwich Mean Time. Maybe that's the real time. I don't know. But the point is that 5-year-olds don't need to keep track of what time zone they're in. Nobody needed to keep track of what time zones they're in. They didn't even have time zones. Nobody needed to keep track of the relativity of time to location. There wasn't such a thing as horse flag, you know. And then trains came along and it began to make a difference because the watches were set for noon when the sun was straight up, and the watches would be different when you got where you're going. Then we got airplanes. sometime between trains and airplanes have invented time zones, bless their hearts. So now our official notion of time has a parameter for the time zone that children don't need to keep track of. And most of us don't keep track of until we make a long-distance call, which don't exist anymore anyway. So what the hell? The point is that the 5-year-old's beliefs about what time it was concern the Pacific zone, but they weren't about the Pacific zone. Why? Because their whole life took place in the Pacific zone. That was when lunchtime was. That's when their watch told the time, so forth and so on. So it's a useful notion, I claim. If you're thinking about understanding the information and truth conditions of what some child or some animal does that makes sense of their life, you may need to take into account parameters that they don't need to take account of. And that's what I call concerning. So primitive self-knowledge by itself concerns the animal that has it. But when you have a self-notion, that self-notion will be about the animal that the primitive self-knowledge concerned. Okay, now, the word I. Mach says, I am that shabby pedagogue. That's the turning point in his life. When he went from Mach the shabby pedagogue to Mach the dapper professor. No, that's not Vienna, is it? Okay, Descartes. You all know Descartes. You all were dragged through at least the first week of your intro philosophy course before you decided not to take it and had to read Descartes' Meditations, where he does not say, I think, therefore I am, because he did not know that that was going to be his most popular book. So his most quotable phrase doesn't occur in his most popular book, but I ignore that. He says it in a more complicated way. I think, therefore I am. Now, as Elizabeth Anscombe pointed out, if he said Descartes thinks, therefore Descartes am, or is, exists, Descartes thinks, therefore Descartes exists, that wouldn't have had the same effect, because this is a portable thought. He gives it to you, and he knows his readers will think the same thing, and each of them will know that they exist because they think, right? Once they get past the second meditation and realize, anyway. So the word I is not all that complicated. It stands for the speaker and expresses ordinary self-knowledge. Each of us refer to ourselves in the same way with the word I. Its meaning doesn't change from person to person, just its reference. And we all express knowledge about ourselves in the same way. Compare now and here. And now and here are interesting because just in the way that there are normally self-informative ways of knowing about people, there are normally now informative ways of knowing about time. If you want to know whether it's sunny now, look outside. The sunniness of what time will you be learning about? The same one you call now. Do you need to know what day it is? No. I often know that it's sunny and can barely get the right year, at least for the first 2 months of a new year, much less the right day of the week or day of the month. So just as Ernst Mach can refer to himself as Ernst Mach, or I, he can refer to July 5th, on July 5th, as today or July 5th. But the ways you know about July 5th when you think of it as today are the same ways you know about any other day on that day. They are normally present informative ways of knowing about what's going on at a time. The ways you know about July 5th are you look on your calendar. And you can look on your calendar and says, what is the day, April 18th? Yeah, April 18th, give a talk to the complexity group. I could easily have gotten up this morning, saw that on my calendar, said, well, maybe that's next week. I'm going back to bed. It happens. Doesn't happen anymore because our computers light up the day that you're looking at it if you've kept it plugged in and everything's working right. It's just like you had a butler that got up every morning and went down and on the calendar circled the day so that his boss, maybe Trump's butler does that, I don't know. And the same with here. So it's a phenomenon, what philosophers call indexicality, these words, I, here, now. Linguists call it deixis, because they don't really know what things are called very well. And there's an epistemic side to it. And as in the case with the self, not so much in the case of locations, but in the case of times, all sorts of bad philosophical arguments, many of them taken over by physicists in their old age, get interested in philosophy, turn on words like I and now. So you can invite me back and I'll give you another talk about now. Not about now, but about now. Now let's see, what's knowing who you are. Say a little bit about knowing who you are. When am I supposed to end? 5, 6, 6:30, 7, 5:30, 5.
I would say 5:35 to 5:45.
Oh, okay, no problem. Let me write a little more here. Okay, so knowing who you are. Usually we know who we are. What's the usual test for knowing who you are? Well, your name. Who are you? I'm John Perry. Who are you? Oh, shit. John Perry. As we get older, it gets harder. But most of us know who we are. And usually the test is we know our own name. But there are exceptions. Elwood Fritchie is my name for a character by Hector Neri Castaneda. Amazing character. Elwood Fritchie is a war hero. There's a battle. He grabs a standard. He charges up the hill. He rallies his troops. But then he's badly injured. And he wanders away from the battlefield, quite a ways, miles away, and kind of not knowing who he is in a daze. And he's finally picked up and he loses his dog tags while he's at it. And he's picked up by a field hospital. He's obviously a GI, so they take him in, but they don't know his name. He doesn't know his name. He's got amnesia. They don't know who he is. Then they check through the records, and the only guy that's missing is Elwood Fritchie, but Elwood Fritchie on the records has blue eyes. This guy has brown eyes. A mistake. But they think he can't be Elwood Fritchie. And they never do figure out who he is. He takes another name, Fred something. I'd have to look at my paper to know what. And, he goes to Berkeley on the GI Bill of Rights because he's obviously a GI. And he gets a PhD in history. And he writes his dissertation about this war hero in the battle he thinks he may have been a part of. The lost hero, the story of Elwood Fritchie. Bestseller. He goes around talking about Elwood Fritchie all over the country, but he never realized that he is Elwood Fritchie. Great story, but I'm going to ignore most of the story and go back to when he's in the hospital. Does he know who he is? Well, no. Who are you? I don't know. But suppose a nurse brings in a meal. Will he say, well, whose mouth do I put this in if I'm feeling hungry? Probably not. So in a sense, he does know who he is. He has primitive self-knowledge. As a leftover from when he didn't have amnesia, he has a self-notion, but it's kind of empty except for the primitive self-knowledge. And he has to start filling it up again. And so by the time he's got his PhD from Berkeley and he's famous, he's got a very rich self-notion. And he's got a very rich Elwood-Fritchie notion, but they've never been combined. That doesn't answer the question, what is self-knowledge? But all right, Descartes' elusive self. Descartes says, recall the meditations from your first week of intro philosophy or whatever it was. So first meditation, Descartes says, I might be dreaming. This all might be an evil demon operating on my mind. Maybe none of this is true. I should withhold belief in everything. I can think of any way of doubting. But that's everything. Oh, shit. I mean, oh, phooey. I'm going to bed. He gets up the next morning determined to get further, and he does. He says, you know, there's one thing I can't doubt. Doubting is thinking. And if I think, I exist. So I do know one thing, I exist. Hooray. And then, in the next meditation, he says, and by the way, as a corollary of my existence, there is a perfect God. And then in the fourth meditation says, contrary to what you might think, he is perfect, and he wouldn't fool you unless he had a good reason. And in the fifth meditation, he says, by the way, here's another argument for the existence of God. And in the sixth meditation, he says, well, I am an immortal soul who thinks and is attached temporarily to a body. We can call the combination a person, but one is immaterial and eternal. The other is material and corruptible. 70 pages, he does all that. Pretty impressive. But some other impressive people have said, Descartes, you know, you're getting Descartes before de Hume. I got to get that in there somewhere, you know. Descartes, you're not entitled to say I in the second meditation. What is I supposed to stand for? If you really were careful and just report what you knew, you wouldn't be entitled to think that there's a person or anything else you can refer to with I. All you could say is, according to Lichtenberg, some thinking is occurring, or thinking is occurring. Or Nietzsche said he should have just said, it thinks, like it rains. And Elizabeth Anscombe decided that I doesn't refer to it at all, and he was completely screwed up. Here's what Wittgenstein said in the Tractatus. The thinking presenting subject, that's kind of the self. There is no such thing. If I wrote a book, The World as I Found It, I should have therein to report on my body, because I can see that, and say which members obey my will and which do not, etc. This then would be a method of isolating the subject, or rather of showing that in an important sense there is no subject, that is to say, of it alone in this book mention could not be made. The book is The World as I Found It. The subject does not belong to the world, but is limited to the world. What does he mean by that? My point is people have said things that seem strange because they didn't think Descartes had the right to use the word I. Hume, putting de Hume after Descartes, Hume said this: there are some philosophers who imagine we are every moment intimately conscious of what we call our self, that we feel its existence and its continuance in existence and are certain beyond the evidence of a demonstration, both of its perfect identity and simplicity. But they're all wrong. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I can never catch myself at any time without a perception and can never observe anything but the perception. So these are what some people who are critical of Descartes said. But my view is that they all, Descartes and Hume and Wittgenstein, all in their way, failed to pass the mirror test. So by the end of the Meditations, Descartes admits he has a body, in all probability, since God wouldn't deceive him about something that important, and that it's intimately connected to his self, which is his mind, which is his consciousness, which is an immortal, immaterial soul, just like the Bible says. But he doesn't think they can be the same thing. Kind of like as Mach on the tram says, there's really a kind of a pre-established harmony people. Well, what that guy does and what I do. I wonder if we're some kind of, never mind. Hume, in his study doing philosophy, now Hume is kind of permanently in the second meditation, because Descartes talks himself out of the world being an illusion, but Hume really doesn't. He thinks the world is just impressions, and that the external world is just a bunch of constructions, fictions, that in the end really make no sense, but somehow are very useful to us. But when you're in your study doing philosophy, you shouldn't think in terms of these fictions. Now, when you get hungry, you have to go downstairs. You think to yourself, well, should I jump out the window or go down the stairs? Should I really take seriously that every time I've jumped out the window, I've been followed by impressions of having a broken arm? And every time I go down the stairs, it's been followed by impressions of having ham and cheese. But there's no necessary connection, but I think I'll go down the stairs. So Hume is kind of thinks his body, along with the rest of the external world, is just an ultimately incoherent fiction we use to keep track of impressions. So he doesn't think himself as an immortal soul, but he just thinks it's the whole. So he kind of agrees with Descartes. If you get rid of the immortal soul, he thinks it's consciousness, his consciousness. I mean, Hume's my favorite philosopher, but it's really hard to put it all together sometimes. Now, Wittgenstein's kind of the opposite. He's happy enough being his body. Well, maybe he wasn't happy in his own body. But he cannot find a subject, more or less a self, in the world, but only as a limit of the world. Well, in all due respect, they're all wrong. There is one thing, me, a live human being with a more or less intact mind, a person. Are live humans the only kinds of persons? I don't know. Could computers be persons? I hope not, but can't think of any good reason why not. I mean, how about chimpanzees? Well, probably so. I'm kind of an animal rights kind of person. Chickens? Well, I don't know. I guess so. They're so good to eat. Worms? Colonies of ants? Colonies of bees? These are open questions. But in the case of humans, I think it's pretty clear. This is me. This is myself. The word self is like the word uncle. Uncle is a person described in terms of their relation to you. Self is a person described in terms of their relation to you. In this case, the relation isn't being my mother's brother, but being me, being identical. We have at least two, several radical different ways of learning about the same thing. Why? Because Mother Nature didn't think things through. She didn't realize that primitive self-knowledge and having little chickens that go around pecking and worms that go around and so forth was going to lead to something like human beings with all kinds of objective knowledge and ways of finding about other things that lead to ways of finding out about themselves, that lead to self-notions, that lead to philosophers' mysteries and religion. And, well, maybe Mother Nature's, that's fine with her. Who am I to say? But, be that as it may, that's the human condition. We know all sorts of things about ourselves in all sorts of ways. Philosophers are prone to find mysteries, and it's certainly complicated and mysterious. But I am a person who learns about myself in all sorts of ways. Interoception, introspection, perception, seeing my names in memos, bills, things from the IRS, and the announcements of the Stanford Complexity Group. Thank you. Yes, sir. I think that's you. I don't think that's me.
Thank you. So how is that different? That there's the one thing, me, alive, human. How is that different from Descartes? I mean, I know there's a difference there, but it seems like a distinction without a difference almost.
Well, I mean, he does not think that, he thinks he is an immaterial thing, right? So he thinks that when he looks down, he's not seeing himself. Now, he admits that we can call what he sees Descartes, and it is really intimately connected with his soul, but he claims they're not the same. And if he didn't claim that, he wouldn't have an argument for the immateriality and the eternality of the soul. So it's not something he would give up lightly. If it wasn't for the Christianity, would he have said that? Well, I mean, you know, you take the Meditations. I mean, Descartes was a genius. He came up with Cartesian coordinates and Cartesian geometry and all sorts of things, and a great scientist. But philosophically, he was very much theologically oriented, trying to give philosophical arguments for things he was taught in Sunday school, is how I would put it. He probably would be offended. So I think there is a difference. I'm not sure I've got to the bottom of it, but there's not. David's going to take us to the bottom of it. David takes us to the bottom of lots of things, you know, bars. And
Exactly. So, our problems got to do with the use of the mirror test as a test or something.
You're thinking about that?
No, I mean, that is, you use the mirror.
Yes.
Yeah, right. I mean, so the picture I take you have of Descartes is whatever he sees by looking at the mirror.
That's a good point.
It's got to be an extended physical thing.
Mm-hmm.
And now, what is a little unclear?
Well, look at it this way. So there's
His soul, as it were, doesn't cast a reflection.
right,
Right?
because it's immaterial. It takes up no space.
Yeah, it takes up no space. So, you know, look at the mirror, okay, you see lots of things. The one thing you can't see is your own or anybody else's who's standing next to you. You can't see the soul. Okay. With you,
Whom?
with you, I get it. With you, it's, well, I mean, the official story is I've never understood this either, but anyway, is that there is no such thing as the self, because he doesn't say there's no such thing as himself. That would be really weird. But there's no such thing as the self, and so obviously you can't see it in the mirror because there's no such thing as.
Well, see, he doesn't. Does he really say there's no self?
Well,
Or he says there's no impression?
yeah. So my,
See,
I
I mean, a lot of things going on here. I mean, you might read this.
I'm a scholar, but I mean, my picture is. I mean, so one picture is that there is such a thing as the self, and it's this complicated. You know, so this is the kind of, I don't know, what is this, Locke, Hume, Grice picture?
Yes.
At some point. Of what the self is this complicated logical construction out of impressions and ideas and relations among them. Probably something weird.
Yeah.
And whatever that is, you can't see that in the mirror. I mean, just.
Well, Locke and Grice held a memory theory of personal identity. So they don't need to say that the self isn't a physical being. Locke was, kind of a Christian, but he said he really, with all due respect to Descartes, he couldn't figure out why the brain couldn't think. So, but
Instead, you can't see it in the mirror.
yeah, you can't. Yeah, well, so for Hume, Hume's a little weird because he seems to say, well, myself isn't anything that has what Descartes thought it had, continues in existence, perfect identity and simplicity, but, do we have any idea of self after the manner so explained? But then he kind of says, well, but we do have it in a different manner, just all this shit, all this stuff that's going on, the collection. So,
But whatever that is, you can't see it in the mirror.
Right.
Whatever that is.
Yeah, you can imagine Wittgenstein, he says, oh, this is interesting, my will, and he used the phrase my will, interestingly, seems to coordinate with the movements of this body, but not with the movements of that body. That's interesting. But he's not willing to take that step. That's because that's me. Yeah. Yes, Dale.
This last paragraph, to what extent could sleepless, or dreamless sleep or meditation of the Descartes or non-Descartes varieties? Just because Hume can't catch himself without a perception, does that mean that perceptions are all that exist? Or, it's just when the argument is basically resting on, I can't imagine something, or all I perceive is X.
Yes, right. Well, dreamless sleep was a problem for Descartes. Because he said, I think, therefore I exist. But he went on to say, my existence, my essence is thinking, consciousness. Material objects, their essence is taking up space. I don't take up space. What keeps me in existence? Consciousness. Well, hey, Descartes, how about dreamless sleep? Makes no sense. You just don't remember your dreams when you wake up. For Hume, but Descartes would have been bothered by it. Hume probably would have said, well, yeah. Hume did not really believe in identity, apart from mathematics. That is, he would say, well, you're not the same person. On your theory, you're not the same person I talked to yesterday. Because, I drugged you and you had dreamless sleep, and so there was no continued bunch of, and you say, fine, that's interesting, that's deep. Does that affect my salary? Hume was okay, at least in some of his writing, some of the time, with just accepting outrageous, what we think of as outrageous views. I know sooner refute your theory than you accept my refutation and call it an insight. There are philosophers like that, mostly named David. Oh, no, I was thinking of you. I was thinking of David Lewis. Eileen.
So I'm wondering when, on your account, will a child first have a representation of space and time? That is,
Space and time.
a child perceiving himself as like one object among other
objects.
In one space at one time.
Yeah.
And whether primitive self-knowledge is sufficient for a child to have this kind of representation of space and time distinct from himself.
Well, as to the first question, I would say beats me, but a lot of psychologists, have looked into it, Piaget, to the different elements. But to the second, I would say, no, it's not enough. I don't think. So take a child that's nursing. Well, they pick up information about the external world, about objects in relation to them, and then they perform, what is it? What the hell do I call them? Normally self-affecting actions, you know, on the baby bottle or whatever it is. So we would need, as theorists, making sense of how a baby operates and get nourished, to say that, well, they have information concerning themselves and they take actions that have results that concern themselves, but they don't have any concept of themselves. Do they have any concept of anything else? Well, nothing as developed as having a sense of space and time. I wouldn't say. When does it begin? I'm sure a lot of psychologists could tell us a lot of amazing stuff that's been studied about this, but you know, by the time they're 4 or 5 and playing hide and seek, they got about as far as I ever got. Listen, you haven't, let her talk. She hasn't talked yet.
Yes.
Or have you?
What?
Have you talked yet? Go ahead.
Okay. I'm really interested to, I think a lot of concept was based on the notion of self-effective action.
Yeah.
So that sort of actually requires an objectification of part of self as being able to be a object of action. And otherwise there were no part to act on.
Mhm.
So neither the self nor others to be a object of action. But in the, I would say in the modern world, any action has some self-effective or positive or negative way, but maybe go on different spatial temporal scales.
Mhm.
But is there a way that to have an action that have an that's absolutely not self-effective, or there's definitely not effective on anything, and that thing would be the limit of the world?
Have you got a good example?
No, I'm thinking, entertaining the possibility. If there are actions that are named effective,
Mm-hmm.
the way that the reason we invent the word effective is because there's something we think is ineffective.
Yeah.
And otherwise we will call that everything, because there's no distinction.
Well, actions are extremely different from perceptions. I mean, that's obvious, but I mean, an action just keeps having effects and effects and effects.
Right.
Maybe forever, maybe for a couple of years, but you know, so a self-affecting action like my scratching my back, well, it has an effect on you. Maybe you'll tell people at dinner about a crazy guy that liked to scratch his back during the lecture, and then you know, so maybe then one of them will write a detective novel about a crazy lecturer who kept scratching his back, and maybe they'll make millions of dollars and donate it to combating world hunger, and they'll succeed. And so my scratching my back will have conquered world hunger. but you know, perceptions aren't quite like that. They're not translating in the same way. I mean, I see you guys in front of me, and you're here because of a long chain of causes and effects, but by seeing you, I don't see the causes of what I see. So it's just, now, with self-affecting action, see, my best example isn't really very good for audiences because it's urination. And I looked through Kant and Descartes and Hume, and you know, they don't talk about it. But when you toilet train a kid, which I have done countless times, you know, they're getting self-informative information. But unlike the chicken and pecking, it's not automatically triggering self-affecting action. Well, that's not quite true.
That's not true.
Yeah, it does trigger self-affecting action, but not the right one. They take an action that gets their diapers wet. And what you want to train them to do is to notice the self-informative sensation, interoception, and learn to release it in the potty chair. And, you know, so, I mean, it's a little bit better than scratching your back because it's just a little more private, you know. But, and then that makes you think, well, I mean, do other animals care about toilet training?
Oh, yes,
Do they?
yes.
They choose where to go.
Huh?
They choose where to go.
They choose where to go? Do they? Yeah.
Chickens probably choose which seats to pack as well.
You know what they say about dogs, they don't soil their own bed places.
Okay, well, dogs, yeah, but I mean, to me, there's dogs and humans and a few others, chimpanzees, and then there's, you know, Washington and yes, sir.
Well, that's part of consciousness in a way, isn't it? Is being able to project into the future, because that requires being able to project into the future. If I don't, you know, if I hold it in and then wait till sometime later on to release this somewhere else, you know, so and that's part of what higher level consciousness is, isn't it? Being able to think in terms of the future.
Well, I think that may lead to such consciousness, this developing the ability to hold it in. But I don't think it requires, I would not think it requires it, but consciousness is difficult. I mean, everybody knows that. But it doesn't explain much. Or if we could figure out what it explained, we'd understand it a lot better. But that's a different talk that I should have ready in about 20 years. Yes?
Curious to hear your thoughts on whether the notion is culturally created, because there are cultures where in Hinduism they believe in rebirth and you can be born as the chicken or a human depending on what you earned in their previous life.
Huh?
So the sense
You
of
will
self.
be born as a chicken.
Yeah, I mean, Jenny can correct me, but Asian religions kind of, and we shouldn't lump them all together, but, you know, in Hinduism, this identity goes on and on and on, and you come back as a chicken, and then you come back as a Republican, and then you come back as a worm. But at the same time, you know, in Mahayana Buddhism, you know, you don't last more than a couple of minutes. It's, you know, it's just a myth, right? Sort of, right? But now those are religious views. But in terms of just the social concept of a self, there's also big differences. I mean, Western, you know, it's a stereotype, but it's got truth. Western societies tend to be more individualistic in terms of guilt, responsibility, duties, and so forth, and not taking to be, you know, community-wide. You know, I'm told, I could be wrong, but that, you know, in surveys done 40, 50 years ago, before the world was so connected, that anthropologists had a hard time getting answers to surveys taken in China with questions like, well, what do you do? I said, well, in my village, and that's the answer. Does that sound credible, Jenny? Sort of, maybe. Whereas, you know, if you go to some hick town like I'm from, or Chadron, Nebraska, say, or Holdridge, you get the same. You say, what do you do? Well, I'm a CPA, and I bird watch on the side, and I enjoy cooking and a walk. You know, you get all these details about the person themselves, and not just. So that's a different level in which, yes, we have a different concept of self. But my guess, and just a guess, is that this basic idea of I am a person, and I learn about myself both in self-informative ways and in other informative ways that happen to be about me, I think that's going to be hard to get away from. But I could be wrong.
But the self could be modified across generations or something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what.
But you still have to combine.
Yeah. I'm supposed to be writing a paper about transhumanism. You know, because somebody called and I was so relieved they weren't trying to sell me air ducts or tell me that my visa was going to be, and they just had a simple request, would you write an article about transhumanism? And I said, sure. Now I've got to figure out what transhumanism is. But it's about the continued evolution of humans, particularly in conjunction with computers, so that we will end up having a completely different conception of what a person is and what a self is, and that somehow, for some reason, would be a good thing. Is that transhumanism? Do I have it right? Any transhumanists here? What it makes me want to do is write a novel about a guy who's got a job 20, 30 years from now. He goes over to Fremont or Union City, and there's a big warehouse full of computers where Elon Musk and Steve Jobs, all these guys had themselves uploaded, and then it turned out nobody cared. So he has to go over once a week and kind of make sure they're all plugged in and everything, and nobody else ever comes by to ask him any questions or get any advice. Good novel?
Oh, yeah.
I never answered your question. Does this mean you're going to come back and ask it again?
Yeah. I'm wondering why it didn't talk about narcissists.
Narcissists.
Yeah.
Why? I didn't talk about narcissists.
Right. It would be sort of.
That's
very
chapter 8. I only got there.
Related to self-knowledge, based on my minimal levels.
So what's the definition of a narcissist? That's someone who's in love with themselves or only thinks about themselves? They don't.
Narcissist himself.
Yeah.
When he was looking into the river of reflection, he couldn't actually. He loved. It's the key. I thought.
Oh, you're going back to the actual Greek myth.
Yeah. Is that?
I can tell you why I didn't do that.
Uh-huh.
I have no idea, but go ahead.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I think the essence of the story was that he loved the person, but he didn't know that he didn't pass a mirror test. So somehow I feel like he drowned because he didn't pass a mirror test, which have a very effective action on himself.
Well, I'm going to go have to look at the myth. That sounds interesting. But what makes me think of is that there might be gradations of how much you really accept that the same predicates that apply to others apply to you, and vice versa. And that, I mean, when we think of certain well-known narcissists, I can't think of any right offhand, you really wonder to what extent they accept that they are one member of a species that shares all the possibilities and predicates of the rest. David, were you going to illuminate that?
No, I just couldn't remember whether Narcissus recognizes himself and comes to, I mean, just what he's struck by is his own beauty. No, but it's his own beauty.
We have somebody who knows.
I thought that the story was that he got so obsessed with himself that he lost track of time.
Oh.
Yes, that's just it. I mean, yeah.
He wasted away looking at himself.
Oh.
Yes, but he does recognize that it's himself he's looking at. It's not like he just thinks,
But-
boy, that's
Oh.
a handsome guy. Yeah. I'm a really handsome guy. That is the picture. Right? That's the picture I get.
How about, using William James?
He was not a handsome guy.
Using William James' idea to might analyze this, because in William James he has like two parts. One's I and one's we. Me, yeah. So I.
The I and the me,
agent,
yeah.
Yeah, and me is really the objectified, like self. I mean, yeah. So here might be he was admiring the me in terms of the object there, but it doesn't really go hand in hand with the I. So he ignored the I part. In general, we have the I and me actually coincide. We know that is the object or your self-knowledge using your word, the information about yourself. And at the same time, you have that realization that you're also an agent, that can add on this self.
Yeah. So yeah, James had the I and the me, and then William Mead developed this idea. And I think there's something to it, and I should try to fit it into this framework because this is a conglomeration of, I don't know, but mostly me, I think. So you have this self-notion, and it's full of stuff you know through primitive self-knowledge, like, you know, I need to pee, I'm hungry, I have a headache. But then it's also full of stuff that's shared knowledge about you by the group. But among that, there's the stuff that you know that it's what everybody believes about you and what you think is right. So there's all kinds of gradations. So there's a great story about this by Borges called Borges and I. And when David stops talking, I'll tell you about it. So Borges and I, it's a very short story. You should read it. It's only 2 pages long. Huh? Do you know the story, Decron, by heart? Borges and I? You know, Borges says, there's this fellow, Borges. He's driving me nuts. He takes credit for everything I do. But he's so vain and pompous. And, you know, and he goes on like that for 2 pages. And he's kind of separating the I from the person that the I is, or the I from the me as reflected in the eyes of others. Because that's who he's describing with Borges, what the world thinks I am. But I don't really feel like I'm that way. And it's a very interesting topic that, you know, can drive people to literature or drink, either one.
Distinction between I and me in Chinese, though.
Yeah.
So
There is or isn't?
there isn't.
There isn't a distinction.
It's the same character. Wondering if that affects how people.
Well, that's interesting. Let me think about Chinese for a minute. I find Chinese squiggly.
Yeah.
Deep thoughts about that, Jenny? Jenny thinks a lot about all these things. Try to draw her out a little bit.
John, the distinction between the object use of the word I and subject use of the word I. And like me should be correspond to the subject object use of the I, and the I corresponds to the object. There are 2 words.
So,
But it's in Chinese.
Hmm? Depends on the dialect, right? See, that's a safe thing to say. Like, somebody gives you a bottle of Chardonnay, you don't know, he beans about wine, you say, well, they've done well with the oakiness. Depends on the dialect, right? Okay, any other?
Just 1 point of information.
1 point of information? You're asking me for information?
No, of course not. I'm going to give you.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So according to Wikipedia, just according to Wikipedia, there's this enormous range of versions of the myth of Narcissus.
That's the dialect.
But
Yeah.
the one relevant one, I gather, it does seem, at least again according to this, that I was just wrong. He's not supposed to have recognized
Oh.
that it was his own reflection. He falls deeply in love with the thing in the pool. Anyway, question. He's unable to leave the allure of his image without, again, according to this, recognizing it's his own image. And he literally wastes away and just the fire of passion burning inside him, I'm just reading, eventually turning into a golden white flower, the narcissus.
Oh, that's where flowers come from, yeah. So this is not the guy that flew too close to the sun.
No, that's Icarus.
And he's not the one that turned his daughter into gold. See, Right, but my memory of Greek history is getting a little vague with old age.
Screwed the swan.
Huh?
The same guy who screwed the swan.
Screwed the swan. Okay. Well, that should be easy to remember.
Any other questions? Okay, let's thank the speaker again.
If I clap, is that
Yeah.
self-affecting or?
Yeah.